Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Richard Ron, and this is part 2 of our 10-part series on changes in lean material management. And what I'm going to talk about in this particular topic is pulling from overseas. And your ability to pull from overseas really will depend on your backlog. In other words, how many custom orders do you have? How far does that go into the future? And to allow you to actually have the time required to pull from an outside supplier. Inside, it's pretty easy, inside the walls of your factory. But going outside would depend on how much backlog you have that you can draw on to be actually pulling based on actual orders. And if you don't have that backlog, and many of you may not, then you're relying on a forecast. So forecast is not exactly pull, but there's some things we can do to improve the connection, right? That direct connection between outside suppliers or overseas suppliers and your internal usage. So with that, let me just summarize quickly why this is an important topic, and then I'll go cut right to the chase in terms of what can be done about it. Important because no matter what you do, let's be brutally honest here, no matter what you do inside the walls of your factory, most of your material is not going to be there. Because it's fairly easy to optimize or reduce inventory at the points of use, at workstations, and in supermarkets. That's kind of under your control. So that's not really a problem. But the problem is going to be when you go outside the walls of your factory and you're buying material from China or from Japan or from Indonesia or from India or wherever it happens to be, South America, because those distances are longer, the lead times are longer, and it's much more difficult to control those quantities. So that's really the central issue that we're talking about. So what I'm going to share with you here is how leading companies are actually managing that. You can look at the graph down below and you can see the change over time. This graph goes from 1950 to today, and you can see it looks like an exponential curve. And this is the United States, but I think this probably applies to most other countries as well, where the amount of international trade, at least until recently, the amount of international trade has grown tremendously on an upward curve. And that's why this issue becomes more and more important. And so if we're interested in improving inventory turns, then this becomes more of an obstacle, if you will, because it's going to generate or normally kind of encourage larger quantities, larger batch quantities coming in from overseas. Let me just mention too quickly, there's this principle in the Toyota production system, one of the 4 core principles. It's called one-by-one production. And so the idea here is that within a factory, within our production lines, for example, we try to design them to be able to build one product at a time, as opposed to moving material in batches from one process to another. So that's a long-standing and well-understood concept. But now we're trying to extend that same thinking to materials. So can we go to one-by-one materials within the factory? Sure, you can. And that's called JIT kitting, just-in-time kitting, or sequence delivery. That is where you're delivering parts in very small quantities or one-by-one to the production line. Now, currently most companies are not extending that to nuts and bolts and hardware. That may or may not ever make sense. But the philosophy or the North Star goal still remains. Let's try to move things one at a time or in very small quantities. Now, when we talk about overseas, that becomes more of a challenge because now we're talking about overseas shipping containers, longer lead times. How do we do that? Okay, so here's how it works. Here's how the system works. Imagine that you have a monthly quantity that maybe you're ordering to fill up a shipping container and it's coming from some overseas location. And you have other things that you're also procuring from that location or nearby. And you break that monthly quantity into smaller quantities, like say, for the sake of discussion, a weekly quantity. And you combine that quantity with other items into the same shipping container. So what you're doing is setting up a pipeline. Now that distance, that time may be 30 days or 40 days from that location, to go through customs, to get on a boat, to be shipped over here, to get received, all those things. But you're setting up a pipeline of mixed containers, each that contain a variety of different parts, but enough volume to actually justify the shipment and not drive your freight costs through the roof. So this is what they're doing. Companies like Toyota, John Deere, and hundreds of others, most likely, are mixing those containers together and setting up this flow of parts. Now, it's not exactly risk-free because anything can happen along the way. But if something does happen, then you're impacting only a small quantity of that total flow rather than a month's worth of parts or more at a time. So if the boat sinks in the middle of the Pacific, you haven't lost everything. You've lost one little piece of this pipeline that's going, and probably that will not shut you down. Whereas losing a month's worth of material could very well shut you down. So that is what they're doing. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. You can read the article in more detail. There's a graph of kind of how this works. So with that, we'll let you go, and stick with us for the next one. The next topic is thinking of material management as waste. Okay, see you then. Bye.